They carried his body like he was already dead. 4 Apache warriors, their faces painted black as midnight, lifting the small white boy above their heads while hundreds of their brothers watched in absolute silence. But this wasn't an execution. This wasn't revenge for generations of bloodshed between their peoples. This was something that had never happened before in the history of the frontier wars. This was honor. The boy's lifeless arms dangled toward the earth as they raised him higher, his torn clothes fluttering in the desert wind like funeral shrouds. Every warrior in the circle had their war paint streaked with tears. Grown men who had never shown weakness before their enemies were weeping openly for a child who should have meant nothing to them. Chiefs who had ordered the deaths of countless settlers were now treating this pale, skinny orphan like their own blood. What could possibly transform a throwaway white boy into the most sacred person in Apache territory? What single act could bridge a hatred so deep it had soaked the desert sands with blood for 3 generations? The answer defies everything you think you know about the frontier wars, about racial hatred, about the impossibility of forgiveness between mortal enemies. But here's what makes this story even more impossible to believe. It all started because of a lie. A deception so simple that an 11-year-old boy used it to fool seasoned Apache warriors who could read tracks in stone and hear whispers on the wind from 5 miles away. How does a starving orphan boy become the most sacred person in an Apache war camp? How does someone who should be their greatest enemy become their most treasured family member? And why are these battle-hardened warriors weeping as they carry him through their sacred burial grounds? The answer began 5 days earlier with a choice that should have gotten him killed, a lie that should have gotten him tortured, and a moment of compassion that would rewrite the laws of the American frontier forever. But to understand how Thomas Creek became Thunderwalker, how a white orphan became an Apache legend, you need to know about the secret he discovered in Dr. Warren's hidden journal, the secret that would either save his life or guarantee his death in the most brutal way imaginable. Because what happened next wasn't just about healing a wounded warrior. It was about a boy who discovered that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't saving someone's life. It's choosing to save it even when you know that mercy will make you a traitor to your own race, an outcast from your own people, and a target for every gun on the frontier. The warriors' tears weren't falling for the boy they were carrying. They were falling for what he represented. Proof that even in the darkest chapter of American history, when hatred had become a religion and killing had become worship, one child's heart remained pure enough to choose love over fear, healing over revenge, brotherhood over bloodshed. But the ceremony you're witnessing isn't a celebration, it's a funeral, and the body they're carrying isn't dead. Not yet, but in 5 minutes, when the sacred ritual reaches its climax, Thomas Creek will cease to exist forever. In his place will stand Thunderwalker, a name that will be whispered around Apache fires for the next 100 years, a legend that will challenge everything the frontier wars were supposed to prove about the impossibility of peace between races. The question isn't how this happened. The question is, what price was he willing to pay for it? Because what you're about to discover is that Thomas Creek didn't just save one Apache warrior's life. He sacrificed everything, his identity, his safety, his future, even his past, to prove that the human heart is stronger than the hatred that history tries to carve into it. And the most shocking part, the lie that started it all wasn't about fooling the Apache. It was about fooling himself into believing he deserved to live. But here's where this story gets darker than you can imagine. Because Thomas Creek wasn't just any orphan. He was the son of the man who had betrayed Chief Iron Feather's peace treaty 5 years earlier, the child of Captain Marcus Creek, the soldier whose broken promise had started the bloodiest Apache uprising in territorial history. Every warrior in that circle knew his father's name. Every scar on their bodies could be traced back to Marcus Creek's treachery, and yet they were weeping for his son. How is that possible? How does the child of your greatest enemy become your most sacred family member? The answer lies in a secret so buried that Thomas himself didn't know it until the moment he opened Dr. Warren's hidden journal, the one the town thought they'd burned with the rest of his belongings. The journal that contained the real truth about the cholera outbreak, about why Thomas's parents really died, and about the Apache medicine that could have saved them all. Because Dr. Warren hadn't just been treating white settlers during the epidemic. He had been secretly working with Apache healers, sharing knowledge, combining their ancient remedies with his modern medicine. The treatments that saved dozens of lives weren't purely white man's science. They were a fusion of 2 medical traditions that weren't supposed to cooperate. And Marcus Creek had discovered this collaboration the night before he rode out to break the peace treaty. The journal revealed everything. How Captain Creek had threatened to expose Dr. Warren's treason unless the doctor helped him plan a surprise attack on the Apache camp. How Warren had refused and been found dead 2 days later, officially from cholera, but actually from a knife wound that only Thomas's father could have inflicted. How Thomas's mother had discovered the murder and confronted her husband, only to be silenced permanently when Creek poisoned her medicine to make it look like the disease had taken her too. Thomas Creek wasn't just an orphan, he was the son of a murderer and the witness to a cover-up that had cost hundreds of lives on both sides. The cholera epidemic hadn't been a natural disaster, it had been prolonged deliberately by a man who preferred war to peace, who killed anyone who might heal the hatred between the races. And now, 5 days ago in that forest, Thomas had made the same choice his father had been asked to make: help heal the wounds between peoples, or let hatred win. The difference was that Thomas chose healing, even though he knew it might cost him everything his father had killed to protect. But the Apache warriors surrounding him didn't know any of this yet. They didn't know that the small hands that had saved Morning Eagle's life belonged to the son of the man who had butchered their families. They didn't know that their tears were falling for the child of their greatest enemy. They didn't know that in 5 minutes, when Black Wolf read the name carved into the turquoise eagle pendant, the name Marcus Creek, which Thomas still carried in his father's old jacket pocket, their honor ceremony would become a blood ritual. Unless Thomas could convince them that sons are not responsible for their father's sin, unless he could prove that healing is stronger than heritage, that choice matters more than blood, that the man you become is more important than the family you were born into. The ceremony you're watching isn't just about adopting a white boy into an Apache clan, it's about whether love can triumph over legacy, whether forgiveness can defeat genetics, whether a child's courage can erase a father's cowardice. It's about the moment when 200 Apache warriors must decide, do they honor the boy who saved their brother's life, or do they avenge themselves on the son of Marcus Creek? And Thomas doesn't know they know. He thinks his secret is safe, buried with his parents in the unmarked graves behind Copper Ridge. He has no idea that Morning Eagle recognized the name Creek from the moment Thomas introduced himself in the forest. He doesn't realize that every Apache warrior in this circle has been debating his fate for the past 3 days, torn between their law of family adoption and their sworn oath of vengeance against anyone who carries the Creek bloodline. The lie that started this story wasn't Thomas fooling the Apache about who he was. It was the Apache fooling Thomas into believing they didn't already know exactly whose son they were about to adopt or execute. Because in Apache tradition, there are only 2 ways this ceremony can end: with the sacred turquoise eagle around Thomas's neck, marking him as family forever, or with Morning Eagle's knife across his throat, marking the final payment of his father's debt in blood. The warriors know which ending their law demands. Thomas is about to find out whether his actions have been powerful enough to rewrite laws that have governed Apache justice for 1,000 years. What happens next will determine whether this story ends with the birth of a legend or the death of a dream, whether Thomas Creek dies for his father's sins, or whether Thunder Walker is born from the ashes of generational hatred. The boy's name was Thomas Creek, though most folks in Copper Ridge just called him that little pest, or the orphan rat. At 11 years old, he had mastered the art of being invisible, a skill that kept him alive in a town that viewed him as nothing more than a burden left behind by the cholera outbreak of 1847. His parents had been among the first to die, leaving him with nothing but his father's torn leather jacket and a promise carved into a pine cross that he would grow up strong and good. The town had other plans for him. Thomas had learned to read the moods of Copper Ridge like a weather vane reads wind. When Mrs. Henderson's mouth turned down at the corners, it meant she was about to chase him away from her vegetable garden with a broom. When Sheriff Morrison's hand drifted toward his gun belt, it meant Thomas had been seen in the wrong place at the wrong time again. When the blacksmith's eyes narrowed, it meant another night sleeping in the cold because even the stables were off limits. But it was Dr. Samuel Warren who taught Thomas the most important lesson about survival. Warren had been the town's physician during the cholera outbreak, and he alone had shown the boy any kindness during those terrible months when death visited every house on Main Street. Warren had been the one to find Thomas crying over his parents' graves. Warren had been the one to explain why people were afraid to get too close to the orphan boy. And Warren had been the one to teach Thomas how to clean wounds, set bones, and recognize the signs of fever and infection. Knowledge is the one thing they can't take away from you, Warren had whispered during one of their secret medical lessons behind the doctor's office. Learn everything you can about healing, boy. The world always has room for someone who can ease pain and save lives. But Dr. Warren had died the previous winter, leaving Thomas truly alone for the first time. The doctor's medical bag had mysteriously disappeared after the funeral, along with his books and instruments. Thomas suspected Mayor Caldwell had sold them to pay for Warren's burial, but asking questions was a luxury orphans couldn't afford. Now Thomas survived by his wits and his fists, scavenging for food and shelter while avoiding the boots and curses that seemed to follow him everywhere. He had grown lean and quick, with eyes that missed nothing, and hands that could pick a pocket or catch a rabbit with equal skill. The frontier had made him hard in some ways, but Dr. Warren's lessons had kept something soft alive inside him, something that still cared about helping people who were hurt. Which is why he was in the forest that morning, instead of begging for scraps behind Murphy's saloon. He had heard the gunshots just after dawn, a rapid exchange that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Gunfire in Apache territory usually meant one thing: someone was either very brave or very dead. Smart people stayed indoors and waited for news, but Thomas had never been accused of being smart, and something about the silence that followed the shots troubled him deeply. He moved through the pine forest with the careful steps Dr. Warren had taught him during their herb-gathering expeditions. Warren had shown him how to read tracks in the soft earth, how to identify edible plants, and most importantly, how to move quietly enough to avoid attracting the attention of predators, both human and animal. These skills had saved Thomas's life more than once, and they served him well now as he followed the faint blood trail that led deeper into Apache hunting grounds. What he found should have sent him running back to town. Instead, it stopped him dead in his tracks. A young Apache warrior lay crumpled beside a fallen log, his dark skin decorated with the red and yellow war paint that marked him as a member of the feared Thunder Clan. But the paint was mixed with real blood now, dark stains that spread across his chest and shoulder like spilled ink. The man's breathing came in short, desperate gasps that Thomas recognized immediately from Dr. Warren's teachings. Punctured lung may be worse. Without treatment, he would be dead before sunset. Thomas crouched behind a boulder, his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end with his own death. This was Morning Eagle, one of Geronimo's most trusted lieutenants. Thomas had seen his face on the wanted posters that Sheriff Morrison nailed to every building in town. Wanted dead or alive, $500 reward for the capture of Apache war leader Morning Eagle. The man lying 30 feet away was worth more money than Thomas would see in a lifetime. All he had to do was run back to town, tell Morrison where to find the wounded warrior, and collect his reward. $500 would be enough to buy a horse, supplies, and a fresh start somewhere far from Copper Ridge. He could stop being that little pest and become someone who mattered, someone with money in his pocket and respect in people's eyes. But Dr. Warren's voice whispered in his memory, "A healer doesn't choose his patients, son. Pain is pain, and suffering is suffering, no matter whose body carries it." Morning Eagle stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping his lips. His hand moved instinctively toward the carved bone eagle that hung from his neck, the sacred talisman that marked him as a member of the warrior society. The gesture was so human, so vulnerable, that it shattered every story Thomas had ever heard about Apache savagery. This wasn't a monster from the nightmare tales told around campfires. This was just a man who was dying alone, far from his family and his people. Thomas made his choice. The warrior's eyes fluttered open as Thomas approached, dark pupils dilated with pain and shock. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, they stared at each other across a gulf of racial hatred that had been carved by decades of warfare and broken promises. Morning Eagle's hand moved toward the knife at his belt, but the gesture was weak, more instinct than threat. He was too hurt to fight, too weak to run, and too proud to beg for mercy from a white boy who should have been his executioner. Instead of running, instead of calling for help, instead of finishing what some settler's rifle had started, Thomas knelt beside the wounded warrior and began examining his injuries with the methodical precision Dr. Warren had taught him. The shoulder wound was clean, a rifle ball that had passed completely through without hitting bone. But the chest wound was worse, blood frothing at the edges in a way that confirmed Thomas's diagnosis. Punctured lung, maybe nicked an artery, definitely fatal without immediate treatment. Morning Eagle watched in amazement as the white boy tore strips from his own shirt, the fabric thin and patched but clean enough to serve as bandages. Thomas worked without speaking, his small hands surprisingly steady as he pressed cloth against the worst of the bleeding. Every few seconds he would pause to check the warrior's pulse and breathing, monitoring vital signs with the expertise of someone far beyond his years. "Why?" Morning Eagle whispered in English, the word barely audible above the wind in the pines. It was the same question Thomas had been asking himself, and he still didn't have a good answer. "Because you're hurt," Thomas replied simply, continuing to work. "And because someone taught me that helping people is always the right thing to do, even when it's the dangerous thing to do."
Morning Eagle studied the boy's face, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives, but all he saw was concentration and genuine concern, the expression of someone who cared whether he lived or died. It was not a look he had ever expected to see from a white child, and it confused him more than his wounds did. Thomas helped the warrior sit up slowly, supporting his weight while examining the chest wound more carefully. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped, and Morning Eagle's breathing was still labored. He needed more than field bandages. He needed real medical attention, the kind that only existed in Apache camps where medicine men knew the old healing ways. "Your people," Thomas said quietly. "Where are they? You need help I can't give you here." Morning Eagle's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been respect. The boy was not only treating his wounds, he was thinking about long-term survival. Most white settlers would have assumed that removing an Apache warrior from the battlefield was sufficient. This child understood that true healing required more than stopping the bleeding. "Sacred Canyon," Morning Eagle whispered, pointing toward the distant mountains. "But soldiers, they follow me. My brothers wait, but they cannot come here. Too dangerous." Thomas understood immediately. Morning Eagle had been part of a raiding party that had been ambushed by cavalry. He had managed to escape, but now he was trapped between the soldiers hunting him and the impossibility of reaching his own people in his weakened condition. Without help, he would either be captured by the army or die of his wounds in the wilderness. The smart thing would have been to wish him luck and walk away. The safe thing would have been to pretend this encounter had never happened. But Thomas had never been particularly smart or safe, and Dr. Warren had taught him that some situations demanded courage over caution. "I know a place," Thomas said finally, "a cave about 2 miles north of here, hidden with fresh water nearby. If I help you get there, will you let me treat your wounds properly?" Morning Eagle stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. Apache warriors did not accept help from white children. White children did not offer help to Apache warriors. Yet here they were, negotiating a partnership that violated every rule of frontier warfare. "If I die," Morning Eagle said slowly, "my death will be on your hands. If I live, my life will be in your debt. Both are dangerous for a white boy in Apache territory." Thomas helped him to his feet, surprised by how much the warrior leaned on him for support. Morning Eagle was several inches taller and probably 60 pounds heavier, but blood loss had left him weak as a newborn colt. They would have to move slowly and carefully to avoid reopening the wounds. "I've been in danger my whole life," Thomas replied as they began the difficult journey toward the hidden cave. "At least this time it's for something that matters." The cave Thomas had in mind was a place Dr. Warren had shown him during one of their botanical expeditions, a narrow opening in the canyon wall that opened into a chamber large enough for several people. Fresh water seeped from cracks in the rock, creating a small pool that never went dry. Warren had called it nature's surgery, a clean, quiet place where a healer could work without interruption. Getting Morning Eagle there took most of the afternoon. They had to stop frequently to rest and to allow Thomas to check the warrior's wounds for fresh bleeding. Each pause brought new risks. Soldiers might be following the blood trail. Other Apache warriors might assume the worst if they found a white boy with their wounded comrade. Wild animals were drawn to the scent of blood, and Morning Eagle was getting weaker with each mile they traveled. But they made it. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, Thomas helped Morning Eagle settle against the smooth rock wall of the cave. The warrior's skin had taken on the grayish pallor that Thomas recognized as a sign of severe blood loss, but his pulse was steady, and his breathing had improved slightly. The chest wound had stopped bleeding entirely, sealed by the pressure bandages and the warrior's own clotting mechanisms. Thomas built a small fire near the cave entrance, using dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. Then he began the careful process of examining Morning Eagle's injuries by firelight, cleaning away dried blood and checking for signs of infection. Dr. Warren had always said that the first 24 hours were critical for any serious wound. Keep it clean, keep it stable, and let the body's own healing mechanisms do their work. As he worked, Thomas found himself telling Morning Eagle about Dr. Warren about the medical training he had received from the only adult who had ever shown him genuine kindness. The warrior listened without comment, occasionally wincing when Thomas's ministrations caused pain, but never asking him to stop or slow down. "Your medicine man," Morning Eagle said when Thomas paused to check his pulse again. "He was Apache?" Thomas shook his head. "White man, but he didn't see color when someone was hurt. Said pain was the same in every language." Morning Eagle was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. In his experience, white men saw Apache suffering as justice and Apache healing as a threat to their own security. The idea of a white medicine man who treated pain as pain, regardless of the patient's race, was almost impossible to believe. "He sounds like a man of honor," Morning Eagle said finally. Thomas smiled sadly. "He was the best person I ever knew. When he died, the town sold all his medical supplies. Said orphans didn't need books and medicine bags. But they were wrong," Morning Eagle observed. "You carry his knowledge in your hands and heart. That cannot be sold or taken away." As the night deepened, Thomas maintained his vigil beside the wounded warrior. He kept the fire burning low, changed the bandages when they became soaked with blood, and monitored Morning Eagle's vital signs with the diligence of a trained physician. The warrior drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in his native tongue, sometimes asking questions about Thomas's life and training. Near midnight, Morning Eagle's fever broke. Thomas felt the change immediately when he placed his palm against the warrior's forehead, the skin cooling and drying as the body's infection-fighting mechanisms gained the upper hand. The chest wound had sealed completely, and the shoulder wound was showing early signs of healing. Morning Eagle was going to live. "You have strong medicine," Morning Eagle whispered when he realized what had happened. "Stronger than many of our own healers." Thomas shrugged off the compliment, but he felt a warm glow of pride at the warrior's words. Dr. Warren would have been pleased to know that his teachings had saved a life, even under these impossible circumstances. As dawn approached, both the boy and the warrior faced a new problem. Morning Eagle was strong enough to travel, but traveling where? He could not return to his people without risking capture by the soldiers who were certainly still hunting him. Thomas could not return to Copper Ridge without explaining where he had been for the past day and night. Their temporary alliance had created complications that neither of them had fully considered. The answer came with the sunrise, in the form of distant hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Multiple horses, moving carefully but deliberately toward their hiding place. Morning Eagle tensed immediately, his hand moving to his knife despite his injuries. Thomas crept to the cave entrance and peered out cautiously, trying to determine whether the approaching riders were soldiers or Apache warriors. What he saw made his blood freeze. Apache warriors, at least a dozen of them, following the faint trail that Thomas and Morning Eagle had left during their journey to the cave. They were moving in the careful pattern of hunters tracking wounded prey, reading signs that most white men would never notice. In a few minutes they would reach the cave entrance. Morning Eagle tried to sit up straighter when Thomas reported what he had seen. Despite his weakness, the warrior's eyes sharpened with the alertness of a military commander assessing a tactical situation. "They are my brothers from the Thunder Clan," Morning Eagle said, "but they do not know about you. They will assume you are holding me prisoner, or that you have harmed me. They will kill you before I can explain." Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but his voice remained steady. "Can you walk?" Morning Eagle tested his strength, pushing himself upright with obvious effort. "Yes, but not far, and not fast." "Then we go out together," Thomas said, making another decision that defied all logic and self-preservation. "You tell them what happened. If they're going to kill me, at least you'll be alive to remember that not all white people are monsters." Morning Eagle stared at him with an expression that Thomas couldn't interpret. "You would trust your life to my words? To warriors who have every reason to hate your people?" Thomas shrugged. "You trusted your life to my hands. Seems fair." The Apache warriors were close enough now that Thomas could hear their voices calling to each other in their native language. Morning Eagle answered them, his voice carrying easily across the canyon despite his weakness. The calling back and forth continued for several minutes, a conversation that Thomas couldn't understand but whose tone seemed to shift from urgent to surprised, to something that sounded almost like awe. Finally, Morning Eagle turned to Thomas with an expression the boy had never seen before. "They want to meet the white child who saved my life. They want to understand how this is possible." Thomas and Morning Eagle emerged from the cave together, the wounded warrior leaning heavily on the boy for support. The Apache warriors formed a semicircle around them, their painted faces unreadable, their weapons ready but not immediately threatening. Thomas had never been so close to so many Apache fighters, and their presence was overwhelming. These were men who had survived countless battles, whose very names were whispered in fear throughout the frontier territories. The leader of the group was an older warrior whose face bore the scars of many conflicts. He approached slowly, his dark eyes moving between Morning Eagle and Thomas, as if trying to solve a puzzle that challenged everything he thought he knew about white people and Apache people and the possibility of cooperation between them. Morning Eagle spoke rapidly in his native tongue, occasionally gesturing toward Thomas or touching his own bandaged wounds. The other warriors listened without interruption, their expressions shifting from suspicion to confusion to something that might have been wonder. When Morning Eagle finished his account, the scarred leader walked directly to Thomas and stood looking down at him for a long, tense moment. "I am Black Wolf," the warrior said in careful English. "War chief of the Thunder Clan. My nephew says you saved his life when you could have taken it. He says you treated his wounds with the skill of a medicine man and asked for nothing in return. He says you risked your own life to help an enemy because your heart told you it was right." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "In our tradition," Black Wolf continued, "when someone saves the life of a Thunder Clan warrior, they become family. Not friends, not allies, but blood family, with all the rights and responsibilities that bond creates. But you are white, and we are Apache. This has never happened before in the long history of our peoples." The other warriors murmured among themselves, clearly debating the unprecedented situation. Thomas caught fragments of their discussion, tones of argument and agreement, voices raised in passion and lowered in respect. His fate was being decided by people whose language he didn't speak, according to traditions he didn't understand. Finally, Black Wolf raised his hand for silence. The murmuring stopped immediately, and all eyes turned toward him. "We have decided," Black Wolf announced. "Morning Eagle speaks truth. This boy has proven that honor exists in all peoples, that courage has no color, that healing knows no tribe. Therefore, we accept him as family." What happened next would remain burned in Thomas's memory for the rest of his life. Black Wolf gave a sharp command in Apache, and every warrior in the group dismounted from his horse. Then, moving in perfect unison, they all knelt on one knee and bowed their heads in a gesture of respect that took Thomas's breath away. "Welcome to the Thunder Clan, young healer," Black Wolf said solemnly. "Welcome to your new family." But the ceremony was far from over.
Black Wolf produced a small leather pouch from his saddlebags and from it withdrew a necklace unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. The cord was made from braided sinew, and hanging from it was a carved turquoise eagle that seemed to glow with inner fire in the morning sunlight. "This belonged to my father and his father before him," Black Wolf explained as he placed the necklace around Thomas's neck. "It marks you as a true member of our clan, with the protection and responsibility that honor brings. Wear it always, and know that you will never be alone again as long as Thunder Clan warriors draw breath." The other warriors rose to their feet and began what Thomas could only describe as a celebration. They sang songs in their native language, performed brief war dances, and took turns approaching Thomas to touch the eagle pendant and speak words of welcome in English or Apache. Each warrior seemed to understand the historical significance of what was happening, the breaking of barriers that had stood between their peoples for generations. Morning Eagle, despite his wounds, insisted on participating in the ceremony. He removed his own necklace, the carved bone eagle that Thomas had noticed during his medical treatment, and placed it around the boy's neck alongside Black Wolf's turquoise pendant. "Brother to brother," Morning Eagle said formally. "Blood of my blood, heart of my heart. Your enemies are my enemies. Your family is my family. Your honor is my honor." The implications of what was happening slowly dawned on Thomas. He was not just being thanked for saving Morning Eagle's life. He was being adopted into one of the most feared Apache clans in the Southwest, given rights and protections that no white person had ever possessed. But along with those rights came responsibilities that would change his life forever. As if reading his thoughts, Black Wolf placed a weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You understand what this means, young healer? You are no longer just Thomas Creek, orphan of Copper Ridge. You are Thunderwalker, son of the Thunder Clan, brother to warriors, protector of the Apache way. This path cannot be unchanged once you begin walking it." Thomas looked around at the circle of faces surrounding him, men who had accepted him as family based on a single act of compassion. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere, like he was part of something larger and more important than his own survival. "I understand," Thomas said quietly, "and I'm honored." The warriors spent the rest of the morning teaching Thomas basic Apache customs, showing him how to properly wear his new regalia, explaining the responsibilities that came with clan membership. He learned the Thunder Clan's history, their traditions of warfare and healing, their complex relationship with the land and the spirits that governed Apache life. Most importantly, he learned about the safe passage rights that his new status granted him. As Thunderwalker, brother to Morning Eagle, he could travel freely through Apache territory without fear of attack. Other clans would recognize his regalia and respect his protected status. He had become in essence a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for decades. But bridges, as Black Wolf warned him, were vulnerable from both sides. "Your own people will not understand this honor," the war chief explained as the ceremony drew to a close. "They will see betrayal where we see brotherhood. They will call you traitor where we call you family. The path you have chosen is not an easy one, Thunderwalker. You must be strong enough to walk it alone when necessary. Thomas understood the warning, but he also understood something else. For the first time in his life, he had a real family, people who valued him for who he was rather than seeing him as a burden to be discarded. The Thunder Clan had given him an identity, a purpose, and a place in the world that no one could take away from him. As the warriors prepared to escort Morning Eagle back to their stronghold in Sacred Canyon, Black Wolf made one final gesture that would cement Thomas's place in Apache history. He called for his horse, a magnificent black stallion that responded to whispered commands like a trained war dog. "This is Shadowrunner," Black Wolf said, placing the reins in Thomas's hands. "He has carried 3 generations of ThunderClan warchiefs into battle. Now he is yours, a gift from your new family to help you travel safely between the world of your birth and the world of your choosing." Thomas stared at the magnificent animal, overwhelmed by the generosity of people who had every reason to distrust and hate him. Shadowrunner was worth more than everything Thomas had ever owned combined, a warhorse trained for Apache fighting techniques and capable of outrunning cavalry mounts across the roughest terrain in the Southwest. "I don't know what to say," Thomas whispered. "Say nothing," Black Wolf replied. "Live in a way that honors the gift. Use your skills to heal those who are hurt. Use your courage to protect those who are weak. Use your wisdom to build bridges between peoples who have forgotten how to trust each other. That is all we ask of our family members." The Apache warriors departed as suddenly as they had appeared, melting back into the landscape like shadows cast by moving clouds. Morning Eagle was the last to leave, clasping Thomas's hand in the warrior grip that Black Wolf had taught him during the morning's lessons. "Until we meet again, brother," Morning Eagle said formally. "Until we meet again," Thomas replied, using the Apache phrase he had learned for such partings. And then he was alone again, but not alone in the way he had been before. The turquoise and bone eagles hung heavy around his neck, constant reminders of his new identity and responsibilities. Shadowrunner stood patiently beside him, waiting for commands from his new master. And somewhere in Sacred Canyon, an entire clan of Apache warriors considered him family. Thomas Creek, the orphan pest of Copper Ridge, no longer existed. In his place stood Thunderwalker, healer and bridge builder, protector of the weak and friend to all who suffered regardless of their race or tribal affiliation. He had found his calling and his family in the most unlikely place possible, and his life would never be the same. The frontier wars would continue for many more years, bringing death and destruction to both Apache and white communities throughout the Southwest. But there would be at least one person working to heal the wounds that hatred had created, one person dedicated to proving that compassion was stronger than fear, that understanding was more powerful than prejudice. Thunderwalker mounted Shadowrunner and rode toward the rising sun, carrying Dr. Warren's medical knowledge and the ThunderClan's wisdom into a world that desperately needed both. Behind him, the cave where he had saved Morning Eagle's life already seemed like a place from another lifetime. Ahead of him lay challenges and adventures that would test every skill he had learned and every value he held dear. But he was ready. For the first time in his life, Thomas Creek was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, and that was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any danger the future might bring. If you enjoyed this story of courage and brotherhood in the Old West, there are more tales waiting for you about the unlikely heroes who shaped the frontier. Stories of ordinary people who chose extraordinary compassion when hatred would have been easier. Don't forget to subscribe for more adventures from the American frontier, where courage and kindness could change the world one person at a time.